This is the second panel, and I believe the focus of the first panel was civil society and the media, and the focus of this panel is the legal profession and public service. So firstly, I'd just like to say I'm Professor Christine Parker from Melbourne Law School, and thanks, Paul, for inviting me to chair this eminent panel on this important topic. And I did just want to start by echoing Julian Thomas's acknowledgement at the beginning of this session of the hurt, the trauma and the great injustice of Robodebt. Nearly 500,000 people were served false debt notices as a result of Robodebt, with massive implications for them and their friends and families. And so we really must honour their stories and those of the whistleblowers and activists and individuals who challenged Robodebt for years without being properly listened to before we could really get to the point of having a panel like this. So for this panel, we've got 5 people joining us. We've got Professor Terry Carney, an Associate Investigator of the ADM+S, an Emeritus Professor of Law from University of Sydney, and a well-renowned expert on social security who served for nearly 40 years as a member of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal and Social Security Appeals Tribunal, and we'll hear a little bit about his experience with Robodebt in a moment. We've got Dr. Aitor Jimenez joining us online. He's a research fellow at the ADM+S with us at the Melbourne Law School, a sociologist, a lawyer and an activist who's worked for progressive causes in Latin America and Europe, and particularly in relation to automation, and becoming a leading founder of the field of digital criminology. So welcome, Aitor, good to see you there. We also have Professor Ed Santo, who was Human Rights Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission between 2016 and 2021, where he led the Commission's work on AI and new technology, among other things. He's now Director Policy and Governance at the Human Technology Institute and Industry Professor Responsible Technology at University of Technology, Sydney. And again, he had an important role in the unfolding Robodebt, which we'll hear about in a moment. And we also have Pia Andrews. She's a strategic advisor of public service, works with Amazon Web Services, and describes herself as an open government, digital transformation and data geek, working within the public sector machine mostly to transform public services, policies and culture through greater transparency, democratic engagement and citizen-centric design. And we'll hear from her in a moment. Now, I have some questions to ask each of the panellists. It'll run very similarly to last time. We'll have 2 rounds through the panellists, essentially a kind of what happened and what can we do better type scenario, and then some time for open discussion. I do have 5 panellists. And limited time, so I may have to speed people along. I'll just warn you of that now. Okay, so I'm going to start with Terry, Professor Terry Carney. So Terry, you're on record as a member of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal in overturning some of the first Robodebts, and then subsequently, I understand, not providing both academic and public commentary about the problematic legal status of the decisions. And yet this didn't seem to have any impact until now, really. What does this tell us about the role of the AAT and similar reserve body review bodies in the Robodebt saga and their limitations?
Well, thank you. It is a great question, and the short answer is that it tells us that the much touted by my generation, and you can see how old I am, that I actually remember when in the mid to late 1970s the new administrative law was put in place to overcome all the deficiencies of the old prerogative writs that were the only way that you could get a case like Robodebt anywhere was to use the prerogative writ and go straight to the High Court, and that was done in Green and Daniels. I might talk about that a bit later. Anyway, it tells us that that new administrative law structure, and that includes the Ombudsman, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, the introduction of a federal court and a right to take points of law to the federal court under the administrative decisions, Judicial Review Act, all of that proved to be pretty much a complete failure for 4.5 years of the life of Robodebt. So, and I wrote a piece about the 7 veils that turned out to, not conceal the body inside, etc., and the failure inside. So what were those 7 as I now see them? Well, there's a failure of executive government, and the Royal Commission talks about that. A failure of the cabinet process. It was gamed, misled, decisions aren't documented, a whole variety of things. I won't say anything further about that. There's the failure of the public service, and you've already heard about that this morning, that frank and fearless advice was not delivered, and indeed worse, that at times in respect of the Ombudsman's office, which was also one of the institutions to fail, but it was also, to give it some credit, it was actively misled by public servants. So executive government failed. Well, what about the judicial branch of government, which in Australia is the courts and merits review bodies like the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, and I'll also say something a little bit about parliamentary committees, and just tell you sort of chapter and verse how they came to fail. Why did the AAT fail? Not because it didn't get a couple of hundred cases and rule adversely to the government, rule that Robodebt was illegal, rule that it was false arithmetic, as has been pointed out by others, and that it was unethical, including unethical under lawyers' codes of practice, and therefore of the way the government was misrepresenting the situation of Robodebt cases at hearings. It failed because the government chose not to appeal any one of those 210-odd adverse decisions to the next level of the tribunal, because the first level deals with 14,000 cases roughly a year, and Robodebts were just 1 in 100 of those AAT cases, or a bit less. So it was really important that any systemic impact of those cases should be reflected in either the government saying, well, all of these people are wrong and we'll prove them wrong by taking it to the General Division where the hearing would have been public and where the reasons would have been made public on the Austerlitz site. They did not do that. We always suspected why that was the case, but as you know, the Royal Commission found evidence of a number of advices by people reviewing these individual cases saying, don't appeal it, because if you do appeal it, it'll become public and that's going to imperil the Robodebt scheme. So it failed for that reason. The Ombudsman failed because at different points, 2 inquiries, none of them addressed the issue of illegality and law. And on one occasion, as the Royal Commission found, the ultimate decision, contrary to the advice of the very good lawyers within the Ombudsman's office, saying there is a real doubt about the legality basis for Robodebt, and here are the draft paragraphs that should be, we believe, included in the final report. They were not included. That's timidity and lack of courage on the part of a key check and balance. Now, it is true, as I've already said, that public servants withheld crystal clear advice about the legal problems, or some of it, from the Ombudsman, but it does not excuse the Ombudsman's office from that failure. Parliamentary oversight committees failed, and they failed just because no lawyers at Melbourne or anywhere else in law schools are taught social security these days. So the South Australian Law Society said, there's a bit of a problem with the foundation of these debts, but they had no knowledge of the Social Security Act provisions that made it much harder to defend and raise a social security debt than it does an ordinary civil debt. That's the fault of the fact that no lawyers, law students and law faculties anymore are interested in teaching the social security law that in my day we did.
I'll get you to wind up.
And
Terry.
finally, the courts failed because the courts were almost failed because they were gamed as well.
Great, thanks. I'll pass to Ed because he's going to go next. So Ed, you're Australia's Human Rights Commissioner at the time that Robodebt was established, operated and ceased, and you were initiating and leading reports into human rights and technology. So can you share something with us about how you came to find out about Robodebt and how you saw your role as a Human Rights Commissioner in engaging with it? What strategy did you have? What you hoped you might achieve?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for having me. I heard about Robodebt from people like Asher Wolf, and I pay tribute to their extraordinary advocacy. And my first instinct was to speak with those humans, to find out from at least their perspective what was going on. And it was a baffling story that, I heard several times, which was, I've received this debt notice, it doesn't make sense to me, no one is helping me make it make sense. To my mind, I am a lawyer by background, but to my mind, you don't need to be a lawyer to know that there's a problem, at least a public administration there. In one sense, that's a problem that has everything and nothing to do with technology. It might go back to something that Pia was alluding to before, which is the fundamental role and purpose of the public service, to make sure that people are dealt with fairly. So to get to the second part of your question, what did we at the Human Rights Commission want to really bring forward in that work that we were doing on human rights and technology? Look, obviously, the answer to every question I'm asked is we wanted to, increase the, protections for human rights, right? That's you're always going to get that from me. But perhaps to give a more sort of specific answer, there were three principles that we saw being regularly violated in the way in which technology was being used on people, and Robodebt really exemplified them. And they were that the government should act fairly, it should act lawfully and accurately, and that it should act accountably. And as I say, with Robodebt, all three of those principles were violated over and over again. And I had a very small role. If you look in the playbill, it would have been, Edward Santo plays the role of headless chicken, trying unsuccessfully and perhaps unstrategically, in retrospect, to try and do something about this. Because let's be honest, I think the Royal Commission rightly has shone a light on the failures within government, But there were also failures in integrity agencies like the Human Rights Commission in our inability to bring this systemic problem to a head earlier. And without wanting to be self-flagellating, I do think we should be reflecting on that. We, or yes to we, right? The people who are in those bodies now, but I acknowledge that I was in the Human Rights Commission in a leadership role at the time. So what does that mean going forward? I'll be very, very brief. I encourage people to disagree with me if you do disagree. Our view was not that technology was in some way, or the use of technology was in some way inimical to upholding human rights, including the careful use of automation in sensitive areas like social security. The question was a much more important one, which was whatever technology you use, or whether you choose to use no technology at all, can you demonstrably prove that your system is not just lawful, but that it is also fair, accurate and accountable? If you can do that, then I have no ideological position one way or another about the use of technology. It's fundamentally about ensuring that those outcomes are achieved. And again, I have no concern, frankly, that if there is a technological, or at least a partial technological solution that allows the government to achieve those outcomes more efficiently than maybe a conventional approach, provided that those outcomes are achieved.
Great. Thanks, Ed. And we're going to move to Aitor next. So Aitor, actually just reflecting on what Terry and Ed have said, they've both mentioned this was a systemic issue that didn't get raised high enough, early enough. As an activist, sociologist, lawyer, I think you've investigated cases like this of government use of automation and AI around the world, or in different places that have led to these kind of breaches of human rights. Can you share some of those stories and how they may be similar or different to what happened here in Australia with Robodebt, and what that might tell us about the limitations in Australia, or if there were any strengths in Australia?
Thank you so much for the huge question, Christine. Let me begin by stating by stressing my solidarity with Amazon workers. They are striking in many places of the world. And this is a really cool moment to say that if something we don't need is a criminal corporation offering services to our governments, our public services. Okay, so what is this Siri case and how it relates with the Robodebt? As you know, on May 25th of 2022, the Dutch government publicly admitted that institutional racism was the root cause of the Dutch childcare benefit scandal known as the Siri case. This scandal led to the resignation of the Dutch government in 2021. This is the first resignation of a government out of an automated decision-making wrong outcome. In order to create risk profiles of individuals applying for childcare benefits, the Dutch Tax and Customs Administration used algorithms in which foreign-sounding names and dual nationality were used as indicators of potential fraud. As a result, thousands of racialized low and middle-income families were subjected to scrutiny, falsely accused of fraud, and asked to pay back benefits which they have obtained completely legally. In sum, the algorithms led to racial profiling. So what were the similarities? So the first similarity is that the same causes of both Robodebt and Siri, both were the same inspiring causes. It was not about a technical system, it was about an ideology. The exclusions of individuals from welfare benefits by the Dutch and Australian administration was not a mere mistake or a technical error. It was a deliberate and calculated strategy linked to a defining feature of neoliberalism, the differentiation between those deemed deserving of social protection from the state and those subjected to surveillance, punishment, control, and governance. What else is a similarity between the two cases? So that at the end, in both cases, in the Syria and the Australian case, algorithmic punitivism has remained intact. For instance, this just came recently. The Dutch Data Protection Authority is investigating DUO, the government agency that implements education regulations and handles student financial requests for, again, racism. And the city of Rotterdam has been risk-scoring citizens and punishing the poor. In Australia, we can see how this punitive algorithmic agenda is ongoing with systems such as the BERA2R, which is a Netherlands-made system, risk assessment tools used to detect potential terrorists, or as has been denounced by the Police Accountability Collective, how Australian Victorian police is using predictive tools to, again, punish the poor, punish racialized population, and prosecute. To start the similarities, but what are the differences? I think that the best and the most important difference is that in the case of the Netherlands, we saw political responsibility, and not fake and unuseful later political responsibilities as denial by Morrison, as we are seeing here. There, they accepted responsibility and they resigned it. And that was a huge, huge, huge difference. Another big difference was the role of the private. As we can see in the Australian case, some consultancy companies has been playing certain degree of responsibility in not acknowledging and detecting the case. And with regards to the legal responses, where first and foremost, as has been highlighted in the previous panel, the GDPR has been somehow useful to defend and protect fundamental rights there. But that also stressed how in the European Union, having an overarching framework, overarching regulatory framework, helps to frame and to grasp and to tackle these kind of issues. In this regard, the incoming AI Act or the AI Liability Act, I think, will help into given more interesting scenarios to tackle these issues, to frame these issues, and to have the tools necessary to operate and to grasp these things. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it there.
That was a really great summary of the differences between what's happened here and in Europe. Pia, for you now. So you've been working in multiple government jurisdictions at the intersection of digital technologies, public policy, governance, and service delivery. So how would you characterise what happened with Robodebt as a technology failure, a policy failure, service delivery, governance? Yes, so how would you characterise it, and what are the reasons for that?
Yeah,
all good.
Hello. I just want to quickly give a backstory. The reason I came to work in public service, and I am here representing public servants today, and it is interesting to me how the Royal Commission has, and I talk about this all the time, hasn't just shown the worst of service, it also showed the best. And I have never seen such a well-informed public debate about the role and intended purpose and expectations of the public sector in my life. It led to lots of online dialogue and discussion around how can we remake the public service in the image of the people who tried to do the right thing, who advocated for their clients, who tried to push things up, who said this isn't working. And for every person you saw in the Royal Commission, there are hundreds more. Most public servants below, let's say, a EL2 level, which is 4 levels down the ranks, feel vindicated by this report, feel hopeful of change, and they want desperately to be able to do their job, right? So I had no care of public service for the first half of my career. I worked in the tech sector. I then went and worked in a political office, hate politics, but it gave me a chance to understand and figure out how to hack that system better. What it gave me working in a political office was an absolute lifelong passion now for public sector. Because when you have a public sector that's working well, the whole society benefits. When the public sector works badly, everyone fails. And all of these senior executives that love to say, the ministerial staffers, they did it. They took all the power. It's their fault. My simple answer to them is always, when they said jump, You said how high. Power was given from the public sector to the political sphere, and that is where we lost balance. So the key thing about Robodebt, and it's one of, can I suggest, it's not a limited set of issues, but it's not just about poor policy, poor automation, or poor administration. It's about all of them. A quick, again, call back to Yes Minister. People love to talk about Yes Minister, and it's sort of a joke about, oh, you know, just saying yes to the minister. But what people forget about that series was it was public servants who were actually containing and constraining the idiocy of some pretty dumb and nefarious ministerial objectives. So the role of the public service is not just to serve the minister of the day, it's not just to serve the government of the day. It's very clear there in black and white in the Public Service Act, you need to serve the government, the parliament, and the people. And it is a balancing act that is hard, but it appears that most of our executive have lost the knowledge about how to do that, have not been trained to do that, and we've seen a rapid culture of expediency, culture of political expediency take over the public sector senior ranks, and that is, I'm happy to say, a key part of the APS reform agenda, which of course the Robodebt Royal Commission report will help to expedite and grow, which is great. So it is all of the above. I just want to talk to each of the three. Poor policy. The way that we do policy right now is a series of black holes. Someone writes policy in isolation. They get thrown over the fence to drafters, who are then thrown over the fence to Parliament, if it's legislation or regulation. That then gets published, which then gets thrown over the fence to someone to interpret and implement. You lose very quickly the point, the purpose, the measures, and you certainly lose any ability to take an iterative or evidence-based approach to improving the policy. Even if you have perfect policy, it probably gets out of date very quickly, and then you lose the ability to fix it. So number one thing we need to do is actually bring policy, design and delivery back together like they were 25 years ago before new public management, and actually start to take a holistic approach where you can iterate, pause and improve, or even stop policies based on their actual impact as it's happening, rather than waiting for an evaluation or for a Royal Commission. Automation, we need actual guidance. You know, I'm so sick of responsible AI frameworks just having a bunch of, fluffy principles, and if you just train your data better, you're going to get better outcomes. What do we need? We need a couple of key things. If it's any form of automation or AI that does decision making, it needs to comply to administrative law, which means it needs to be able to trace back to the actual legislation that under which that decision was made, and needs to be able to test against the law to make sure it's a lawful decision. Number two, you need to actually monitor for impact. Don't just say, oh yeah, we're meeting our policy objectives. Arguably, Robodebt met its policy objectives, just created enormous harm along the way. So we've got to stop just measuring and monitoring for what's easy, what's convenient, or just the financial or policy outcomes. We need to be monitoring for unintended patterns of human impact to trigger pause, stop, or change. And then the third thing we need to do is actually have independent governance. So there should be a single register for whole of government where everyone has to register their use of algorithms, AI, automation, ADMs. And each one of them should have a risk assessment that is publicly available, and the high risk ones in particular should have independent governance outside of those departments. So then we get into poor administration. Just briefly, I know we're on the clock. With poor administration, what we need to do is recognise the failures that happen with this. We had a failure in public service mission, a failure in purpose, values and culture. We had a failure of lawful and responsible administration. There is a huge cohort of senior public servants who love to say, what's missing is frank and fearless advice. I put to you that all the frank and fearless advice in the world doesn't change your responsibility to implement in a lawful way, to not cause harm, and when harm is detected, to mitigate that harm. The public service has a job to responsibly implement, not just to advise. I would argue that actually a lot of advice went up, but when you have a master that says no to good advice, you still have a job to work lawfully. So it's just not a good excuse. And there's a debate happening right now online around the old chestnut of FOI and transparency gets in the way of frank and fearless advice. You know what? If you can't stand behind your advice when it's in the public, it's probably not good advice. Evidence-based advice, written down, and then FOI'd, actually is a tool for the public service to maintain our integrity. So I'm going to put that one to you. And the final part of that is there is definitely an issue with culture. There's definitely an issue with expertise that used to inform decision making. You used to have social service experts write the legislation, write the policies, write the framing. But nowadays we have separated policy off to be its own little generalist clique. You've got senior managers across the service who are generalists, who don't understand the substance of what they manage because we introduce managerialism as a thing. And so the gap, and this is critical, between expertise in the lower ranks of public service and those making decisions has grown with mutual incomprehension and disdain. So what we need to do is actually recognise and reinstitute expertise into decision making, into policy making, and actually value the expertise and experience, not just from across the ranks in the public service, but of course from the public as well. It's only when you can do public administration with a valuing of expertise and experience that you start to get the right sort of outcomes. So there's a few thoughts.
Thanks very much, Pia. Very clear. Paul, so you've long studied automation in Australia's social security system, including having worked in the Australian public service. So what are your observations then about public service culture in play during this Robodebt saga and evidenced in the Royal Commission?
Thanks, Christine. I first wanted to say that I tried to get Andrew Podger, Professor Andrew Podger, who was an Australian Public Service Commissioner and wrote a very important report to the Royal Commission, which is available online. He wasn't available, and the current Australian Public Service Commissioner and his deputy weren't also available. So you get me instead. And I just wanted to reinforce some of the observations that Pia have made, but also that they are in Andrew Podger's report, that the change of the public service occurred very much from 1994 when the Prime Minister Keating introduced contracts for the senior executive service. Andrew Podger has made the point that this has led to what he's called excessive responsiveness. And as a result also has led to a lacking of independence and also reduction of expertise. And so what we can see is that Robodebt is an outcome of our culture that's not new, that's been long developing. And as Pia also mentioned, and Andrew Podger points out, that the public servants are responsible to the minister, to the parliament and the public. When I was in the public service in the late 90s, we were told that the number one customer was the minister, and at that point in time I was actually quite uncomfortable about that concept because it dismissed everything else. But that is fundamentally what has occurred, is because the number one customer as the minister drives everything. And the important thing also that has just been mentioned is the difference between the senior executive service and the rest of the public service, because the senior executive service are the ones that are contracted and they get promoted on the basis of being responsive to ministers. Now what we see, even just looking at the public service values, is there's a difference between the principles which are breached and the practice. And it's almost as if they know the principles but they don't know how to implement them. So we see breaches in the APS values of legality and following law, of courage and giving truthful advice, and also in the model litigant approach. So the government should act as a model litigant and not abuse its power as a big resourced organisation. Within Centrelink, we also saw the idea of adding the surcharge to debt, which was normally applied only to difficult customers, to everybody by default. And so we see a number of practices that are occurring. I was working in the Department of Social Security from 96 to 99, and understanding the social security since that time. And it was very obvious that anyone who had any glance or any connection with social security would have known that income averaging is not possible. It's just so like social security 1000 or 101. You know this is not possible. So how do they actually do it? Well, either they actually don't know, they're not well briefed, which is hardly likely, they just didn't care. And so this culture that I saw in the late 90s was very well already in place. This is and I was told I asked too many career-limiting questions. But what I did observe is that the public service were telling the minister what they thought the minister would want to hear. And there was a whole lot of practices, like giving verbal advice, which enabled government, ministers, but also senior executive to have plausible deniability. And you could see that through the reporting and the evidence that was given at the Royal Commission. And I want to just conclude with one story that I had heard, which I saw repeatedly through the whole process. I had a colleague that was working in the budget part of the DSS. He was an equivalent to an EL1. He was there with the minister, Jocelyn Newman, as a background, providing the papers, etc. The senior executive were briefing the minister on the budget proposals for that year. And this particular one came up, and the senior executive said, this is the policy that we talked about, this is the details, and she says, yes, thank you very much. My colleague shouldn't have spoken, but he said, Minister, you need to be aware if this policy is implemented, sole parents would lose on average over $100 a week. Jocelyn Newman said, oh, why wasn't I informed? And said, I'm not going to proceed with that. I wasn't told what that policy is, but I suspect it's a very policy that Gillard, as Prime Minister, introduced many years later. But that says to me everything about, we're not playing politics and being apolitical. They're doing what they think the minister wants to do, which actually undermines the capacity for ministers to make informed decisions and to also decide whether they want to do something. And that actually infantilises the minister at the same time. Now, that's not always the case when you see you've got a bossy minister, like the reports of the former Minister Morrison and etc. But these are the kind of cultures that get in place and get embedded, and they're very hard to unpack. And I'll speak next about what Andrew Podger suggests as the next way forward.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, so now we're going to move on to focus on the implications of the Robodebt saga for your various areas of expertise, and what role administrative law, regulatory agencies, human rights law and processes, and the public service, and I'm going to add the legal profession and law schools, since I think Terry brought that up as well. So what role might all these in the future play in how governments design and deploy automated decision-making and artificial intelligence? We've heard the elements of Robodebt are still going forward in many ways throughout the public service. Can it be designed, used, and made legally accountable in a way that is responsible, ethical and inclusive, and if so, how? So Terry, I'll start with you again. What, if any, are the administrative law lessons of Robodebt? Are there legal or governance reforms you think important? And you did also mention some of the role of lawyers and law schools and the training in legal professionalism as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and I'll try to be really brief this time. Three spheres of recommendations to address that question. The first, and I think critically important, and I'm with Ed in this, ADM and AI is ubiquitous. It is going to permeate all aspects of government administration as well as the rest of society and our lives. It's just that in social security, given the vulnerability, we have to be slower. Instead of it being first cab off the rank, which it was in Australia and Britain, to introduce it, it should be one of the last areas of government administration, and we need to take much greater care about it. What are the principles that ensure that you get it right? The Royal Commission has them. In a word, it is called co-design. proper co-design, genuine co-design, done in partnership with people. Some other governments elsewhere in the world say they're doing co-design when they're still doing top-down. I think I know what social security recipients really need, and I'm imposing it on you. So the whole set of recommendations there in the report, including that every system, human or artificial intelligence, must be comprehensible to the users. I mean, it's a basic proposition. It means that it be in simple language, and neither the human letters, the letters about human decisions in social security, for 40 or 50 years they've been unintelligible, despite my efforts when I was on the Social Security Advisory Council trying to get government to get it. And the AI ones are equally as untransparent and unintelligible. That's number one. Number two, we need to renovate the accountability frameworks that I discussed. There were very good recommendations for ensuring that the courts can't be gamed, that the AAT can't be gamed, that the Ombudsman does their job of looking at legality when it's appropriate, that parliamentary committees are better informed and so on, and that, very importantly, the reason that there was almost a failure of judicial review was because there was only one legal aid commission in the country that looked at social security. You've heard that. And it took 4 or 5 times as long to get its test case up, its first test case, compared to Green and Daniels in the 1970s, when the only way was the awful, cumbersome, take it straight to the High Court under the prerogative writs. There is some culture change that needs to be seriously reflected upon within legal aid commissions. They had the brief indicating illegality from the get-go, one of my phrases, and yet it took whatever it was, about 18 months compared to the 3 or 4 months that Green and Daniels got. It's not me making that point. My former academic colleague Peter Hanks KC made that in that AIL paper, from Green and Daniels to Robodebt was what he called it, to make that point. The third, and perhaps in many ways taking my lawyer hat off and putting my public policy hat on, is this culture change. Excellent recommendations that the Royal Commission has come down with. As the Royal Commission itself points out, will only be effective or fully effective if this culture of scapegoating the unemployed and welfare, dole bludgers, and we are the world's historically best. We've always had a gold medal for over a century in being able to stigmatise and scapegoat the unemployed. We did it before Federation, and we've been doing it, all parties, ever since Federation. And, it infects the kind of mindset of AAT members, of judges, of lawyers in legal aid commissions, or etc. This culture change that the Royal Commission, I'm super pleased to see, puts front and centre on page 2 of the 960 pages of the report. It's all of Australia's, every Australian citizen's responsibility. It's not the media, it's not the lawyers, it's not the government, it's all of us as citizens to speak up, to call out that appalling picking on the weak, the poor, and allowing them to be disempowered in the way that Robodebt, highlighted.
I'll pass it to Ed. Thanks, Terry. So, Ed, would you be able to comment firstly on what role you think the Australian Human Rights Commission might be able to play in the future, whether reactive or preferably proactive, in ensuring we don't see a repeat of Robodebt? And also I understand that now you're working more at UTS with training public servants and actually working on the culture in public service. Could you comment on that as well, please?
Yeah, thanks. I'd endorse, by the way, everything that Terry just said. I think it was a powerful statement and I think it's spot on. I'll make 3 quick observations. The first is, and I hope I'm not speaking out of school here, The Robodebt experience from the perspective of an integrity agency was quite uncomfortable. I note that it's a lot, nothing compared to actually being a victim of Robodebt. There were not a lot of people within the Commission itself who saw this as a really big human rights issue, which was interesting. And we were, largely sort of shoved out of rooms, decision-making rooms, whenever we tried to enter them. I think that's something to note. I think we could have been more forceful and more creative at getting ourselves back in those rooms, but we were constantly told this is not a human rights issue. The other point I want to make, and this is a little part of the story of Robodebt that I think needs to be told over and over again, so I apologise if people have already heard it before. But the public servants and right up to the minister were so seduced by the idea of Robodebt when it was presented to them that they, but before the tool had been developed, let alone tested, let alone rolled out, they took $400 million out of the budget for that particular financial year. And not only that, they took it out of their forward estimates. So that's how you got $1.6 billion out of the budget. So when you had people like Terry, like Asher Wolf, like the Ombudsman and so on, jumping up and down saying there is a problem here, this is unlawful, that statement of fact, that statement of reality could not be accepted because the money was already gone. The savings had already been banked. And there's a really fundamental problem here, which again, I've been very unsuccessful at remedying, and that is, again, nothing to do with technology, but there's a quirk in our system that applies both at the federal level and the state level, that in that sort of scenario, when the money has already been taken out of a department's budget, it actually makes sense to let it get bigger and bigger and bigger and wait for the litigation to take place if it is to take place. Because that ultimate payout, what was $1.7 billion, that doesn't come out of the department's budget. That comes straight out of consolidated revenue, which is a terrible moral hazard, right? It means that the department is not incentivised in the way that it should be to actually address these sorts of problems because it makes sense to allow them to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, so that's the first 2 points. The third and final point that I want to make really relates to your question about training. I don't know a polite way of putting this, so I'm just going to say it plainly. There was a deep well of ignorance that the public service and the kind of political class were trawling when they came at this question of Robodebt. That is, they did not understand the people on the strategic side did not understand the technology at all. They thought that they were buying magic. They thought that there would be this magical way of hoovering up all of this money that was owed to the government and that it would just kind of come sloshing back into the government coffers. Of course, they were wrong about that. But that ignorance is not something that we should accept. Those of us who are sort of in the accountability space one way or another, we need to be responsible for upskilling ourselves. It is not enough. If you've got interest in this area, it is not enough to say, you know what, I'm not really a tech person. You don't need a PhD level degree in data science, but you do need to understand how these systems work and don't work. The thing that we should be aiming for, which is socio-technical systems that bring the best of the human and the machine, you can only design those sorts of systems if you understand enough about the technology involved. And so the work that we're doing is fundamentally about that. Yes, we need more PhD level data scientists, and there's really important work done by others about that. The problem that we are looking at is how you upskill people in those more strategic roles so they have what my colleague, Professor Nick Davis, refers to as a minimum viable understanding of the technology that they are so desperate to procure and then deploy. Because unless they have that understanding, we see right from the very outset these systems go wrong before they're even developed. The procurement systems, the design systems, and so on go wrong because they can't. It's the cliche of right. Everybody is speaking English, but they're not speaking the same language.
Great. Thanks, Ed. I love that minimal viable understanding. I'm going to go to Aitor next again. So Aitor, what can we learn about similar international examples in terms of law reforms Australia might pursue? So I guess, really, what are your thoughts about how justice might be done here for those victimised by Robodebt and to seek to prevent any future unjust uses of ADM and AI?
So the only good thing about these terrible examples is that we have much to learn from, and that perhaps change and works towards an emancipatory future. First and foremost, both cases, so the City case and the Robodebt cases stress, is that the harms caused by the Robodebt and the City were not of technical origin, glitches, or the problem of a few rotten apples, but the result of nefarious neoliberal policies. So in order to end with further Robodebts, further cities, it's not only about designing a new system, it's about end with pernicious neoliberal austerity, because otherwise will be other series, other Robodebts, digital or analogic. That's the most important lesson I think that we can learn from here. The second is cultural. One of the most interesting things that I've read from the report from the Royal Commission, it was astonishing, no? It was a manual case of how public servants are silent and complicit with pernicious politics, with pernicious outcomes. That's something that we have to learn, especially lawyers. No, I just want to flag three comments from the report: that lawyers were constrained by the culture of the department, that they took a remarkable passive approach to the provision of legal advice in relation to the scheme, and they generally failed to undertake the critical analysis that will be expected of a qualified lawyer. No, so we are seeing that it's not only about training them in human rights, training them in technical stuff. It's about values. It's about morality. It's about you are being complice. You're being complicit of a crime that is causing so much harm, that is leading people to die, that is leading people to suicide. No, it's making them part of the common good, of the common objectives. Third, something that we can learn from both cases is that Robodebt and series are only a part of the wider continuum of punitive strategies against the poor and the racialized population. As we speak, the Victorian government proudly itself in delivering a state-of-the-art facility on time and budget, referring to the Cherry Creek Youth Justice Center, which is a prison for the youth. As you know, in Australia, solitary confinement for youth is rampant, among other kinds of tortures. Prisons, policing, repressing the poor is another extension of what Robodebt was aiming at: punishing the poor, governing the poor, oppressing the poor. Only when we tackle this, we can start thinking about regulations. And in this regard, there is some stuff interesting in the report, in the Royal Commission report. For instance, I would like to highlight the recommendation 17.2, the establishment of a body to monitor and audit automatic decision making. I think that's a very good step forward. The only thing is that, as some others have highlighted about with regards to the Siri case, is that how this potential entity that will monitor the algorithm run by governments, how do we control this auditing new institutions? How do we engage? How citizens, civil associations, victims take part in overseeing these potentially harmful algorithms? No. So again, to summarize, I think first, in order to tackle this, in order to reach the legal, first we have to tackle the political. We have to tackle the cultural. We have to clarify what do we want with these kind of things, because it was aimed at policies, and only then we can actually think in regulating stuff. Thank you.
Pia, over to you again. So what do you see as the key areas for changes in the public service? out of this.
Thank you. A couple of things. First of all, to Ed's point about expertise, I do see a pattern where everyone's trying to just train the public service with the assumption it doesn't know what it's doing. There are many people in the public service that know what they're doing. There are lots of people in that department who knew what they were doing and tried to go up the chain and say, this doesn't work, it's illogical, it's illegal, it's bad, hey, look at the impact it's having, holy crap. And all of those people were told, get back in your box. So the fundamental starting point needs to be not just a shift in culture and a shift to management style and a shift to embracing expertise as something of value, not something that's constrained to the lower echelons of public service, but it also needs to be about putting in place measurable behavioural performance indicators for senior executives that goes to, have you delivered on the outcome? Have you done the right thing? Have you actually been a steward for public good? Have you upheld the law? These kinds of things. So we need to shift the culture and expectations of the senior executive service. Most of these people that you saw did not come to government pre-formed. They were shaped into that behaviour. So we need to shift the incentives and the training and the performance management of senior executives in public service. I spoke a little before about shifting how we do policy. Absolutely critical. We need to have a regulators will often have, here's a reference implementation of how you should implement this regulation, and then they hold regulated entities to account to that reference. Isn't it interesting that legislation, which is just how we regulate public departments, are not held to the same standard? Why are there not the public policy twin of the legislation so that you can test, well, I have these circumstances, so tell me what I'm legally eligible for. Oh, I got this answer from the department. Why is it different from what the law says? We need to actually have legislation as code so that you can test against it, so that you can assure against it. And ideally, even if you want to use AI systems that are not explainable, you should at least be able to test against the law. But ideally, any business system, including AI, should be able to consume the law as code so you actually get a consistency of its application. No, I'm not saying all law should be code, but public digital legislation is a necessary part of a trustworthy system and systems you can test against. We need to have actual guidance about AI in government, not a bunch of principles and prayers. We need to be able to say, okay, monitoring for impact, number one. If it is something that is producing a decision, it needs to be compliant to administrative law, exactly to this point, which means it needs to be explainable, traceable, and testable. And unfortunately, I'm sure you've all noticed this. Actually, maybe not. They came out with a definition of explainability a couple of years ago in the federal government's AI guide, where they defined explainable as telling the person that they're interacting with an AI system. That's explainable, apparently. And then they extended it to say, and providing a recourse, mechanism for recourse. That's still not explainable. So we need to use English in the way, or language in the way it's meant to be. Explainability is very clearly defined in administrative law, and every government system, whether it's AI or not, needs to comply to administrative law. I think that we also need to not just be able to consume the law and test against it, but we need to be measuring for not just policy impact, but for human impact, measuring for patterns of human impact, and then have active escalation and mitigation of harm. If a policy, doesn't matter how well-intentioned, doesn't matter if it's meeting its policy intentions, is producing harm, it needs to be mitigated. That needs to be an active and proactive process, not something that only when it comes out down the track. And on that note, I'm involved in a research project explicitly looking at that. So if any of you, given we're talking to a room of academics and research institutions, want to get involved in how we might identify and escalate the unintended human impacts of policy, please get in touch. And the final thing I'm going to mention is there are several major reform agendas happening right now that we can tether all this into. I am delighted that the APS reform agenda has made as much progress as it has in the last year. I am delighted that the Secretary for Public Service Reform, who's now the Public Service Commissioner, has explicitly said that the APS reform review was actually the start of the reform agenda, not the cap of it. So they are explicitly looking at the Robodebt Royal Commission report. They're explicitly looking at Coldrake integrity review from Queensland Government. They're explicitly looking at a whole bunch of things that could help drive system and structural reform. I genuinely believe Australia is leading the way in structural systemic reform of its public service. Everyone else is just looking at digitisation or service transformation or whatever, but in Australia there is a commitment to reform, so if you don't get involved in helping shape that now, you'll have to come back in 30 years to try again. So getting involved in the APS reform agenda is key, and of course the data and digital strategy that just came out, which is a step, could be expanded significantly. Of course, some of the recommendations from the Robodebt Royal Commission report says design policies and processes with an emphasis on the people they are meant to serve, which goes to co-design, but it also goes to test-driven. Have you ever noticed that evidence is great for identifying a problem, but terrible at determining a solution? Because if you just guess at the solutions, guess-driven development, as opposed to test-driven development, then you end up repeating the status quo, repeating what you thought worked last time, repeating a historical paradigm. So taking a test-driven approach to identifying policy interventions, to identifying policies, to identifying services, to identifying legislation and regulation that's going to work is a critical step. They also talk about feedback processes from staff. We do need to not just have your chain of command as your feedback mechanism. You need to be able to report outside of your chain of command, otherwise everything gets constrained by the Secretary of the day. And you need to establish a body to monitor and audit automated decision making. We've been asking for this for years. Come on. So we need to be able to understand the unintended, but we need to go further than what the report asked for. Unintended impacts, lawfulness and explainability. In New Zealand, there's a thing, section 23 of the OIA, which is their FOI. You explicitly have in New Zealand a right to an explanation of any decision about you. Now this, you can invoke this right without having to go to a court, without having to go to AAT. You can just say, hi, what basis was this decision made? And they have to provide not only the laws, but all of the artifacts that went into making that decision. It is a right in New Zealand. I would suggest that our FOI Act, our Privacy Act, some act, should actually take section 23 of the OIA from New Zealand and implement it here. Final thing, I promise I will say, I actually had a whole bunch of slides for this, so I'm going to send those out. We need a shift in mindset. We need to shift from, oh, we just provide frank and fearless advice and then we do what we're told, to a mentality of frank advice but fearless stewardship. This implementation of stewardship as a value into public sector, which is being defined right now, and I'm contributing to that a fair bit. Stewardship means when the minister says do something stupid, you either actively say no or you, actively do no. Stewardship is not just the amount of public servants, senior public servants that genuinely don't know that what's in the Constitution and legislation is irrelevant to what the minister says. You don't have to go to the minister to check everything you do. I literally was working in government when we made that shift of, oh, we've got a new government in, we better check everything we do with them. I'm like, no, we don't. Until they change something, you keep doing it. And governments only change 10 to 20% of what the whole of what government's supposed to do anyway. So the mandate of your legislation and constitution sits above the minister's office. And then how you run your programs and your operational policies is within your control. You don't have to go to the minister for everything you do. So people have lost at what point are you supposed to engage and what healthy engagement with the minister's office even looks like. And as the person who worked in the minister's office, I didn't exactly have that fear, so it was a different sort of conversation.
Pia, we might...
I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. But
I'll say one last thing, which is this. A quick quote from Terry Pratchett. There is no justice, there's just us. We need to do this.
Thank you. Thank you. And Paul, I believe you've got some key areas for change in the public service as well.
Thanks, Christine. I want to just begin by noting some of the suggestions that Andrew Podger made in terms of trying to address the culture from the top, and trying to recognise the kind of incentives that secretaries and senior executives place. And his recommendations is that there should be greater independence and role of the Australian Public Service Commissioner in the selection and approval process of secretaries. At the moment, the secretaries are responsible to the Secretary of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, which has often been a political appointment or politicised appointment. He also recommends annual reviews of secretaries according to the values of the APS that are undertaken by the Australian Public Service Commissioner. So some of these are important incentives, but again, if we can change some of the ways in which the incentives and forms of accountability at a senior level, that can help to have some flow-on consequences. But it also means that we need to think about the ways in which the public servants are actually promoted, and what the accountability mechanisms further down as well. I guess I want to focus my response now in terms of the intersection between technology, public service and administrative justice. And I think in all of these things, these are challenging things because often experts and departments are siloised in all of these different dimensions. And I mentioned before is that there seems to be a challenge between the link between principles and how we enact ourselves, our practices. Now, we saw the breaches of that. But we can also see where people are wanting to adopt principles. So prior to the last election, the then opposition, Labor and the opposition benches, with the encouragement of ACOS, managed to introduce into Workforce Australia legislation the requirement for a technology protection framework, which said that any decisions made under the Workforce Australia needed to be accountable, transparent, in line with human rights principles, etc. Talking to the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations, it was clear that the people who designed the system didn't understand what that might mean in terms of the way in which they designed the system. They thought if we just designed it to enact the legal requirements, that was sufficient. So this means that we actually need to really think within the public service about actually how do we do inclusive, accountable technologies like explainability, etc. It means we need far more multidisciplinary teams than we currently have. Now that multidisciplinary teams feeds not just within but out, and I don't want to say anything other than repeat the other previous comments about the importance of co-design. And the importance of an oversight body, potentially a register, but all of those things need to have that multidisciplinary expertise. Now, some of the challenges that we have in administrative law and appeal processes is that under administrative law, we review individual decisions of administration. Robodebt demonstrated that we have a code, an algorithm that is systemically making incorrect decisions. We do not have any legal capacity to appeal or review the code. And that's really an area that we need to think about legal reform and how do we do that. That said, there are recommendations that have been made multiple times, but also within the Royal Commission report is the way in which there needs to be independent legal capacity to review code or design. I've often talked about the idea of having government as an API, an application programming interface, so that people can actually get into and engage with the way in which technology is being designed. And finally, I want to say is that we need to think also about how we can use technology outside of government to help to keep government accountable. It's very difficult to get governments to change their use of technology, but we can also think about how does technology being used from the outside enhancing the way in which we do government and do public services. And Lindsay Jackson's work on just creating Not My Debt website, which provided visibility to stories of the impact, but also provided resources for people affected by Robodebt to know what their rights were, to their avenues for engagement, etc. That's a very low-tech but important tool. I'm working with EJA at the moment and Avis, my PhD, my postdoc over there, to build a data extraction tool that would enable welfare rights lawyers to better understand the client files of like hundreds of pages so that they can actually engage clients better with government and clients to do that. And we actually need to think more carefully and more capably about how the external sector can use tech as well to help give that accountability.
Thanks, Paul. So that's both rounds of questions for the panel. So I'm going to open it up to the audience as soon as you have some questions. I do know, Pierre, you need to leave right on 12:30. It's possible we might go a few minutes over the 12:30. Yeah, I figured Kim would be fine with that. So feel free, please, to just leave if you need to. And do we have a question already? Yes, thank you.
Can you hear me? Hi, thanks. What a fantastic panel. I'm so thrilled to see this discussion happening. I'm Chris Wright, I'm a lecturer here at the law school. A mild criticism a techie could make of the Commission's report, no fault of the Commission, was that too little evidence was adduced about the nature of these unintelligible tools that Terry described so pellucidly. The ADEX debt schedule, the EANS reports, the multi-cal, and the net to gross calculator that was introduced in 2019 to service Minister Roberts' additional proof point fix, validated thousands of robodebts. The report was unable to put in practice the problem that Pia put so cogently, that these instruments are not tagged or tracked back to the actual Social Security Act. And yet, and of course, I think we've already talked about today the evidentiary problem, the lawfulness problem related to the evidence, that you couldn't get enough probative evidence, Brigg & Shaw, or however you want to put it. But as Terry's decisions at the AET also showed, the statutory calculators like section 1067G, the youth allowance calculators, which has actual steps, consider 1, consider 2, etc., in the legislation, were ignored. And instead you had these internal instruments, the ADEX debt schedule, etc., becoming the source of truth for these debts. No reference whatsoever between the instrument and the law. The prescribed legal calculators were completely bypassed. So Terry and other members at the AET's first tier had to scrutinise these tools and reverse engineer the opaque thinking of the department. I work a lot in therapeutic goods regulation, and the tools there, the drugs, need approval and oversight before they are approved for market supply. And if they are used off-label in practice by a practitioner, that practitioner has a licence and is given that authority through their clinical qualifications. But these ADEX tools were extremely easy to grok. You could actually get an FOI, get the ADEX schedules, and kind of work out what they were doing. And, you know, just quietly, that's what I was doing with Kay from Not My Debt support. But these were quite old-fashioned tools, and the newer tools, including the net to gross calculator that came in 2019, was the completely digital tool that we've never been able to access through FOI. We don't know how it works. I think I know how it works, and I think it includes income averaging still, because it uses the ATO tax rate and applies it to fortnightly income. But, you know, casual workers are taxed at different rates every fortnight because the employer withholds tax according to the tax tables. I digress. But we can't road test some of these tools because FOI is just paper still. We don't get digital copies of the AIs or the instruments. And so how do we govern them if we don't know what they're doing? This goes to the question of explainability. We probably need not just paper FOI, but digital FOI too. A tool's code should be transparent potentially so that you can study it if it's applied to you. Or we need a clinical description like we see in therapeutic goods legislation and clinical trials so we know what it does. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Do you mind if I go first? Being, I think, the nerdiest person on the panel. Two things. First of all, it is fascinating to me how everyone loves to describe a problem and then jump to a solution. To your proposed solution, I don't know, but I will give you a couple of extra facets to understand. If we get transparency in social security systems, we still have the same problem in lots of other systems because we need to go to the cause as to why we have unexplainable systems in the first place. And partly that has got to do, as Paul started to get into, with the fact that each discipline in a department is functionally segmented away from every discipline. The IT department is basically told, here are the business requirements of the rest of the department, just do your job, just implement what we tell you. And if they say, oh, but this doesn't quite make sense, they're told, shut up and get back in your box. So tech, and it's funny because TGA is one of my favorite examples I give when I talk about bad regulation, because one of the early pieces of regulation around heart monitors, didn't take into account open Wi-Fi. And so I actually use it as my case study around if you'd actually had a multidisciplinary drafting team, they could have possibly pointed out that open Wi-Fi on a heart monitor is a bad thing. And I literally know people who would walk into a room, people could hack not even hack, just connect to the Wi-Fi of their heart monitor and shut them down. So what we need is multidisciplinary drafting, number one. We need legislation as code, particularly around things like social security, where it's 80-90% prescriptive rules. All the prescriptive rules should have a reference model publicly available that then the departments use, but then anyone else can test against. Because what's happening right now is that IT department that is told, here's the business requirements, just build, are usually handed the end result of some operational policy person mashing up, right, the legislative rules and the operational rules. There is, unfortunately, in a lot of systems, and increasingly in a lot of systems, no distinction between authoritative rules, the law, and operational rules, the department's interpretation or subsequent things. And little things, I mean, like in New Zealand, we actually found a benefit that was being mispaid because the calculation in the legislation said A plus B equals blah. And we found, oh, we're getting a different result. And then we found that it's because the business system had codified a 30-year-old spreadsheet that had a macro that halfway through the calculation had been rounded down for the sake of expedient reporting. And because it's New Zealand, not Australia, they said, oh, are we overpaying or underpaying? And we sort of cautiously went, oh, you're overpaying people? They said, oh, that's all right. And we went, oh, yay. Whole different culture. So again, the culture about public service and what the role of the public service is part of this as well. Australia's got to realise that we started as a punitive system of a penal colony, and we've got to actually turn that right around. So if we had rules as code, if we actually had our legislation prescriptive rules as code, then we would have a shared interpretation from the people doing the policy modelling and reform, through to the people implementing it, through to the people using the services and the advocates and the not-for-profit sector being able to then test back against it. Right now, everyone interprets their own version and you end up with myriad interpretations of the same rules, which then leads to complete inconsistency in how it's applied. So, and if you go right back to test-driven drafting in the first place, unfortunately, because everyone started going down the principles of better route, you ended up getting more interpretation, more inconsistency, more inequity in how services are being drafted and rolled out. So my suggestion, is better drafting, test-driven drafting, legislation as code as a reference implementation, and a test suite of that, so you can actually test what the rules say you're supposed to be eligible for and not. And then proactive explainability. It is, I think, fine to use rules-based AI, because rules-based AI is consistent over time and traces back to rules. Machine learning-based AI isn't just a problem from explainability, it's actually a problem for rule of law, because a machine is actually changing its interpretation over time, not the justice system, not a person with delegation to do the judgment. So my suggestion is also, if you're using ADM, to use rules-based ADM, consume and test against legislation as code.
Thanks, Pia, and I think Terry would like to comment as well.
Yes, sure, this is on. I do have a very loud voice that people...
Yeah, I think for the recording,
they can't hear it there. Is this on?
And the Zoom. Yes, it was on. You were right.
You can hear me? You can now. 2 quick points. I've got an open mind but I have a degree of scepticism about the contribution that can come from legislative code and those other systems. I think they should be progressed. But for me, the answer to the question, because actually Robodebt it was automation, it wasn't artificial intelligence or any kind of algorithm. I think my academic colleague Simon Chesterman put his finger on it when he said, well, we do need proactive explainability. That New Zealand reform that says anybody can ask for an explanation of anything probably may even go too far, I don't know, but to be practical in an Australian context. Be ideal if we could get it. Certainly everybody should be able to get a clear, plain language explanation of the decisions that matter. And then Simon Chesterman's second component that I agree with is, and there has to be a human being who is accountable for that decision. His point is, it's not the fact that AI makes a decision, but that there's no human being who's accountable for it. And I think what the Royal Commission has added to that mix is, and it's a face-to-face ability to engage with that human being before stepping out into the accountability machinery of tribunals and etc. I think that's comparatively easy to design into the reforms, and I think the set of recommendations that the Royal Commission has published will go a long way towards achieving what I've just described.
Thanks, and Paul wants to say something.
We've been talking a lot about the ways in which automation is making administrative decisions, which are legal decisions by government and often have surrounded legal review processes. I want to just put on the table that increasingly automation and machine learning, this is where machine learning is being used, are for things that are not government decisions. It was mentioned before, the Job Seeker Classification Index, where we profile people into different forms of levels of risk of unemployment. There is no administrative decision made in that. Similarly, when you submit your tax office tax return, there is a profiling to see whether you're at high risk of actually your tax return is fraudulent or incorrect. There is no administrative decision made there. In the Netherlands, when the Syrie case was highlighting particular groups of people for investigation for welfare fraud, there was no administrative decision that was conducted there. In the UK, in that Netherlands case, the only way they actually were able to overturn it was on the European Union Human Rights Act. We actually don't have any capacity in Australia to actually engage with those more subterranean uses of digital technology. And I don't have any answers at this point in time, but I think we need to be alert to this is where a lot of things are occurring, and they currently don't have that legal oversight at this point in time.
Good point. Paul, you had a question from online? Yeah. Great. So Suvradip asks, what would co-design with vulnerable service users look like? Do we have the requisite institutional frameworks and processes to support this? If not, what is needed and how do we get there? And how do we prevent such co-design from being a checkbox or green lighting exercise?
Totally. Can I jump into that just real quick? Okay, so first of all, I think a lot of co-design started getting adopted in service design, which is fine, but it's the tail wagging the dead dog. What we actually need to do is ensure that the co-design is happening at the policy design in the first instance. Because if you are only doing co-design when it comes to the service delivery, then you've already presumed a whole bunch of aspects about what it is, why it is, how it's going to run, etc. So policy development in Australian federal government is not treated as a practice. There is no policy practice, there's no policy practice leadership, everyone does their training or their degree and then they go into the fray, and then there's not really a lot of evolution in the sector beyond that. To the point where I've seen too many public servants that think that policy is only advice to government, whereas they forget all the other forms of policy, which is really quite terrifying. So we need to retrain and get a consistency in training and policy in what policy is, all the different forms of policy, and what good policy design looks like. We then need to have, and I think that the APS Charter for Engagement, which is being developed as part of the APS reform agenda, and please contribute to helping shape that, could be a mechanism to get a consistency for how the public service, and not just the comms teams, but normal average public servants and policymakers actually engage with the public directly and genuinely in developing public policy. I have done many public policy, public engagements and co-design of policy where it's not just here's a consultation paper, give me some comments where I've already set the framing and expectations, but it's actually been completely blank slate. Here's the problem we're trying to solve. Is this a valid problem? Okay, how could we go about this? How might we, and actually doing it genuinely collaboratively. I would suggest that then by having a shift to how policy is trained, how policy is engaged, the APS Charter of Engagement can explicitly codify this for the federal government. We could then see a culture of, maybe engaging in the expertise and experience of the general public will result in better policy. Because until you shift that mindset, then it's always done as a minimum viable compliance activity, if it's done at all. So yeah, co-design at the policy end is critical, and test-driven and more transparency of that. And then in the delivery, of course, co-design as well, not just of the policy interventions, whether it's legislation, regulation, a service, a grant, whatever, but then also public participation and transparency and visibility of the implementation over time, so that people can have feedback loops and mechanisms to say, holy crap, this has had an unintended impact on me and my community, or we've now run the government proposed policy through a Indigenous lens, and here's how it actually conflicts with our laws because we have our own, ways of monitoring and measuring for policy success, which is not yours, etc. So I think that transparency engagement, the mechanism could be the Charter of Engagement, the necessary shift in how training is done, and just getting some consistency, because the entire academic sector teaches public servant policy in different ways, which means that we end up losing any consistency of language or process or methods across the sector. So we also need to at least have anyone that's training policy should be training in some consistent use of language, consistent methods, so that we don't get more fragmentation of that sector. Those are a couple of my thoughts.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to comment on that? No? Or is there one more question? Yes, great. Wait for the microphone. And please introduce yourself. Oh, no.
Hello, is that better?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yay.
No, it's just, I completely agree with what you're saying about policy design and looking at policy design separately from service delivery issues. But the problem with our situation now, which was really highlighted by Robodebt, is that DSS and policy development is separate to Service Australia and service delivery. And where you're talking about connecting back to legislation, got the Social Security Guide, which carefully formulates guidance as to application of legislation and then provides links to the actual legislation. Then the delivery of those policies by Services Australia, decision makers in Services Australia and all officers there, and Services Australia tells this, their Bible is the operational blueprint. So let's not worry about the silly old Social Security Guide that's too complicated and too legal. We'll purely provide guidance to our staff using the real world operational blueprint, and we regularly compare the two and find that the operational blueprint guidance waters down, for example, discretions, or beyond waters down actually provides an incorrect application of the law. And a lot of people I know are concerned, and I know this was considered at the Royal Commission, about the effects ongoing of separating the delivery agency from DSS. It's been in place for a long time, but it just gets worse and worse.
And that's why the recommendation that they do talk about in the recommendations in the report about having to go back and look at whether the structure is working. And I think everyone knows it's not. So the fact that it's been raised as a recommendation for the government to respond to is great, but the key thing is we can't just say they shouldn't be separated. We should be putting forward what the alternative model should be. And evidence like that, I think, is really helpful. And it's not constrained to Australia, it's everywhere. And again, I think it's largely because of that functional segmentation. The people doing the interpretation of the law were separated from the people doing the implementation of it, and never the twain shall meet. I've seen situations where the legislation says X, Y, and Z, then operational policy has added new requirements that then got treated with the same level of authority, even though they're not, and sometimes they conflict, etc. So this is why having a policy twin, having something that actually says, here is a shared interpretation of how this should be applied, needs to be available to test against, to report against, to consume, and to hold to account that sort of decision making as well. And to be fair, this is also where actual machine learning could be helpful in monitoring for patterns. You know, being able to monitor for, oh, here's a group of people who have been affected completely differently to another group of people from this same policy. So there's ways to look for impacts at scale that we couldn't do before, that some of these new tech can actually be helpful for, but it doesn't mean that the tech should be the decision maker, as it were, or the interpreter. And unfortunately, I've seen one government, not Australia, that was saying quite recently that, oh, we don't need, we don't need legislation or code, we don't even need to draft legislation anymore because we can just use ChatGPT for that. And that is scary. So at least in this country, we've got this whole Royal Commission has given us a point in time to sit back and plan the sort of society and access to justice that we want, which is very good. I'm going to have to go, sorry. Thank you.
I think we better close off the panel at this point, if that's okay with everybody, and let Pia get off to get her plane as well. So I'm going to thank our fabulous panel, Ed Santo, Terry Carney, Aitor Jimenez on Zoom, Pia, and Paul. Thank you so much. And yeah, we really dug into those issues, and I'm going to hand over to Professor Kimberly Weatherall from University of Sydney, who I understand is going to wrap everything up and tell us what we learned.
Thanks, Christine. Unlike everyone else in the room, now I'm too loud. Thank you, Christine. And let me just acknowledge that it's a bit intimidating coming after a panel like that with such expertise. So I've been given the task broadly of summing up and offering some concluding results, and then looking at what we might have learned today. An important question we have been asking ourselves today, and indeed for some time now during the Royal Commission, is how did we get here? How does a system that is illegal and that has caused such deep hurt to people become a thing? And how does it continue for literally years? And I want, like previous chairs today, to take a moment to acknowledge both the trauma and that we should be, and that it is okay to be, angry. Angry about the trauma that was inflicted on literally 500,000 people, and the circles reverberating out from 500 million people, 500,000 people, and the circles reverberating out from those individuals, their families and their friends, not to mention the harm caused more generally across Australia to our trust in our various institutions. But part of what today is about turning that anger to productive ends, because today, with the title of Beyond Robodebt, acknowledges that as much as we are engaged in a debriefing, we also need to be forward-looking. And that matters because we are at something of a pivot point. Automation, as we've heard repeatedly today, is not over. Of course, it never stopped. And as Terry said, it's ubiquitous. We are seeing ongoing expansion of automation in government and beyond. We've heard about the ongoing problem of automated suspensions, and even mundane problems like how do you upload the PDFs you need to, in light of persistent digital divides that have been recorded by people like Julian Thomas. More than that, more than automation, we're also, as we've heard, at the cusp of public sector reform, potential public sector structural reform. We're at the cusp of new forms of AI. Now, if it's okay to be angry, it's also okay, I've heard a lot today, to be, and it's important, to be hopeful. Right? I've heard that word a lot today, and that word is warranted, because there are people in this room, in real life and virtual, and beyond, with good ideas and a commitment to making things better. So this could go well. We could take this moment to reflect, to learn, to plan, as Pia just said, to have more responsive, more inclusive services that recognise that different people have different needs, that could be more efficient, that could be consistent with human rights, that could not just be consistent with human rights, but also serve human outcomes, to address power imbalances, equity imbalances. And we do have a moment of opportunity. The Robodebt Royal Commission itself is an opportunity. It's shaken things up. It's made people pay attention. There's a need to take that momentum forward. We've heard there are other opportunities right now to engage with what happens from here. The Australian Public Service Reform Agenda that Pia mentioned. She also mentioned the data and digital strategy consultation that's ongoing now. There's the Safe and Responsible AI consultation that's ongoing now. The New South Wales government is also looking at automation and its AI frameworks and strategies. And we know, by the way, that the New South Wales government is also very strongly focused on where it can make savings, but it also has a good foundation of thinking about human outcomes. And we need to keep an eye out, of course, for the opportunities beyond the formal. One thing that this whole Robodebt saga has taught us, and the people who've appeared today, including Asher and others, is the value of civil society, of activism, of mobilisation. In terms of where to from here, I just wanted to, I guess, summarise some of the things that I've heard, see if I've missed anything, see if we've missed anything, see if there are other ideas we need to bring from the room, maybe other priorities amongst the things that I've heard. So I've heard that we need to be taking up, pushing, continuing to push for the adoption of the recommendations of the Royal Commission. There's a momentum here that we need to take advantage of. But of course, many of those, and they, not to downplay their importance, many of those are focused on law and institutional reform. Culture, of course, is a big focus. We will need to move beyond these, is something I've also heard, because as Monica points out, a system can be legal and still do horrible things. Simone Casey pointed out that compensation questions should still be on the table. Ed Santo brought up the need for a human rights framework. Pia talked about the need for human outcomes and measurable human outcomes. So we've got the recommendations of the Royal Commission, we've got the need to move beyond those. I've heard a lot about the reform of the public sector and how we address questions like culture change, to empower and enculturate the public sector to focus on responsible implementation and acting lawfully. What was it? Frank advice and fearless stewardship. Training, but also incentives in the public sector. Guidance on how to do automation well. Fixing some of the problems with the guidance that apparently exists and wrongly defines things like explainability. The reform of how we do policy making and how we connect it to service delivery. Another thing I've heard a lot about is the importance of amplifying voices. Scarlett talked about this, Simone Casey talked about this, a call for rethinking how we do involvement with civil society, how government does involvement with civil society. Meetings are not enough. Co-design and the need for co-design to move back into policy development, not just service delivery. And I do think that's important to underline, because as members of the first panel pointed out, people will always need to fight. Democracy, even rule of law, is not a thing that you just set and forget. It's a practice, it's a process, and it is, again, to quote Terry Pratchett, it's all of us. From a research perspective, because, we're a research centre, one thing I have heard too is that there are important projects around this room and amongst all of us that will need to be connected. and that can benefit from each other. We've got the UTS projects around automation. We've got Pia Andrews' project on identifying and escalating unintended consequences and looking at that. We've got Paul Henman's various projects and the work at the centre. We are working to common ends, and no doubt we need to keep connecting, keep talking, keep sharing our learnings, so that we can, you know, it's not like there isn't enough work to do. There's more than enough work for everyone to do. But we'll make our best impacts together. And I've also heard, just finally, about media, just to segue into the ADM+S symposium that's later this week. I heard about public interest media and its importance, the practice of media. One of the things over the course of this week at the symposium I'm interested in thinking about is how what we've learned from the Royal Commission about media connects with the way that media, technology and business models are going, like personalisation. So is there something we can do there? So plenty of calls to action, plenty of areas to work on that I have heard. And so what I want to do now is hand over to you. Is there anything in that or in this room this morning that we or I, probably more likely I, have missed? Are there priorities within that set we should be focused on? Are there any concrete ideas we want to feed as, you know, immediate priorities to the centre and or other people in the room? So at this stage, it's very much over to you. No. One thing that, like, thinking about all of that, we still face a challenge of connecting the knowledge and the discussion in this room to actual concrete change. And I am definitely very interested in hearing more about how we make that connection. Because I was having a discussion with Pia this morning before the event, you know, who pointed out that, you know, that lack of connection between research institutions and government, and the fact that, you know, the expert advice that research institutions might provide is more often provided by KPMG and the like these days, is a challenge. So again, how do we address those problems? Paul, wait for the mic. It's coming, promise.
One thing I was reflecting on is the conversation about Robodebt is always about the Australian federal government. And we've talked a little bit about other jurisdictions around the world. But what I observe in some of the innovations, both in Australia and internationally, is actually not at the national level, but at the more regional or localised level. So like in New York, we have the requirements about AI explainability. In Australia, we have New South Wales has actually been quite proactive through the New South Wales Ombudsman, its report, the Machinery of Government report, and the research that you're leading, which you might want to mention. But also in New South Wales, again, we have the changes in requirements and where contracts, outsourced activities require that the companies need to make sure that the public service are able to access code or decisions, etc., so that the public servants can do their job, whereas in past, there is opportunities for public servants to say, well, if we can't access it, it's under confidentiality, or we don't have the contractual application. So there are, I think, important insights and models that are being developed around the place that I think we can look hopeful for in that. And I'm just wondering whether you wanted to just share a little bit about the New South Wales Ombudsman research that you're part of, but whether you see, and also New South Wales has just announced its AI inquiry as well, as opportunities that where there may be links from state governments and around the world to feed through into changes in the federal government, because we talked about the APS, but the public service cultures are may be different, slightly different in other places too. So that also gives rise to opportunity and hope.
I definitely think it's right that there are opportunities in our multiple layers of government. You know, as you point out, the New South Wales government has been active in creating the AI Review Committee, for example, to look at big projects in the area of AI. It has its AI assurance framework. It has involved external experts in that. Ed Santo, Bill Simpson-Young from the Gradient Institute have been involved in that process. And that is, you know, directly getting into government, looking at projects that are being proposed, reviewing them, giving feedback on them, which is really valuable. The Ombudsman's project, of course, is a different one. You would know, you're also involved, which is, you know, following on from the New South Wales Ombudsman's earlier report on automation and administrative law that looked at that question of how law and administrative law applied to the use of automation. The one thing that the New South Wales Ombudsman realised it didn't really know was how much automation was going on, how much ADM was being used across New South Wales government, and that's why they've asked us to do that mapping, which is a process that we're undertaking now, which is, you know, again, potentially over the long term feeds into the kind of thing that Pia was talking about. You know, maybe we do need a register. We need to know what systems are being used. We need a level of transparency about that. We need a level of transparency about the consideration that was given to those systems. So, you know, and that's, you know, in some sense, a kind of experimentation at the New South Wales government level. The Victorian government and the Privacy Commissioner down in Victoria, OVIC, has been extremely active in thinking about AI, writing about AI, talking about automation and the use of information. So, I mean, I do think there are definitely opportunities beyond just the Commonwealth government. Interesting little comment from Pia, though, which is one of the challenges we have in Australia is actually getting the states to learn from each other, or the Commonwealth to learn from states, because sometimes it almost seems like if someone else has done it, well, obviously I couldn't. Obviously we have to do something different. I think we need to move beyond that. Christine.
Sorry. It's not directly related to what you just said, but something that I was reflecting on from the coverage of Robodebt and also from our discussion this morning is when we're talking about a human rights framework and policies and administrative review, the tension, maybe it's a productive tension, maybe it's not, between the civil and political legal rights idea of human rights and the economic, social and cultural rights idea. And I mean, I think Terry made this point that, you know, one of the marvellous things about the Royal Commission report is front and centre the idea that we have to change our culture of how we think about welfare and welfare recipients, that it is a human right or a social right, but yet it's still, and that's the fundamental systemic driver in many ways of this particular problem, and maybe of some of the other automation problems that we're going to be seeing as well. But on the other hand, most of our tools, even if we get to a semi-decent human rights framework, it's going to still be aimed at those more individualised, legalistic sort of civil and rights to review and so on. That's when we actually start talking about anything very concrete. That seems to be what we start talking about. And that won't necessarily, you know, there's always ways to game those systems. So somehow or other, yes, of course, those procedural rights are very, very important, but the substantive rights we have to be part of a human community, to be supported through our times of vulnerability, the fact that we can all be vulnerable, and that's what we're here in a society and have a government for, to support us in those times of vulnerability. Like, you know, that seems like a huge shift to me, and I don't even see that even if we get stricter human rights agencies and so on, whether, you know, can we really move forward on that?
I'm so glad you brought that up. It's actually one of the reasons why I kept saying human outcomes as well as human rights, because it does go beyond that. But I know, Terry.
Yeah, look, thanks for that observation, because that was the issue that I'd forgotten to address from the first panel that I promised. In my social gadfly, perverse, out of you know, minority sort of viewpoints about issues, for which I do have a bit of a reputation, let me make this observation. I'd said that we're a world leader in stigmatising the unemployed and vulnerable people, and we are. We're also, as was commented, one of the very few, I think there's only two, aren't there, us and I forget the other country, that do not at the national level have any human rights legislation. We do have in Victoria, the ACT and Queensland, very weak human rights models, the so-called dialogue model, where parliamentary supremacy continues to reign supreme, as it does not reign supreme in the Dutch example. Okay, the Dutch Robodebt was brought down only by their strong human rights, European human rights framework, where the human right overrides parliamentary prerogatives and sovereignty. You've got to reflect. My reflection is, well, can that be changed? And for all of my life, I've advocated for human rights legislation. And it's a debate for another occasion, but on the 7th of March, the Australian Human Rights Commission ran a really interesting seminar on its proposed dialogue model for the national level, which does include socio-economic rights and indeed environmental rights. Very progressive in terms of what it sought to cover. And I was asked as a member of that panel, and I think you can still access it, from the 7th of March of this year, would such legislation, if it had been in place, would it have changed anything in respect of Robodebt? And the answer is no, it would not. The only thing that could have brought down Robodebt, just like the Dutch example, would have been one that overrode Parliament. And look, frankly, I don't think the prospects of a national human rights, even weak, dialogue model are particularly strong. I hope it might be introduced, but I wouldn't, as a betting person, want to put any money on it. And I think that just tells us that the way to introduce a human rights framework is not the legal mechanism necessarily of replicating what the rest of the world has done. It's finding other non-legal social, civil society or other processes. This is my gadfly point, that we've probably been backing the wrong horse in saying that the way to get the human rights framework in place is necessarily putting all our eggs in enacting a Human Rights Act at the national level. I no longer think that. And I think that instead we should be debating, at least as a complement or as an alternative, all of the other ways in which a country can respect the dignity of human beings and fundamental rights.
I actually think that's a good place to close. I think that's a provocative set of thoughts that we can all discuss over lunch. At this point, I might just hand back to Paul to close up, unless you want me to just close up. I'll hand to you. This is your event.
Thank you, Kim. I just want to begin by thanking everyone for your participation in this event, particularly our guest panellists through today, and for them attending either in person or online. I want to thank all of the petite people who helped to organise the event. Kathy, where's Kathy? She's not here in the room at the moment. And also Matt and our tech person. I've forgotten his name. Thank you, Mitch. Thank you for running those behind the scenes and also for our catering. But also thank you for all of our attendees for your contribution to today's conversation, and I do hope that there's a lot there to stimulate people's thinking in your own work and in your own activities, but also given an opportunities to kind of explore further connections here. And we, I think as a Centre of Excellence and me as the lead of the social services focus area, have got some interesting take-home points that we might think about how do the Centre better engage in our public responsibility to be participants in public debate and helping enrich and enhance knowledge of digital technology across society. So thank you everyone, and with that I'd like to close and invite everyone to join us in lunch. So thank you very much.